So what we're going to talk about tonight is what it was really like migrating to SharePoint Online. And when I say SharePoint Online, I also mean Office 365, because for better or for worse, when you move to one, you move to all. You can't just pick one and kind of stick with the SharePoint side of things. I started out as a SharePoint dude, but I'm now fully into the O365 realm. So let me do a quick intro of who I am. Let's see, I'm an engineer by training. I actually went to school for civil engineering, but unfortunately graduated in 2009 when nobody was hiring engineers, at least in the civil realm. So I sort of sold my soul to become a mechanical engineer, and I worked on Navy nuclear reactors for, well, the U.S. Navy. And did that for a couple of years. I did mechanical systems for that. I actually designed the top for one of the reactors coming up in, I guess, one of the new classes of ships coming out sometime soon. We had SharePoint come out reasonably soon into my tenure there, and I kind of fell in love with that, for better or for worse, and spent a couple years doing that as more of adoption. I generally don't code. I'm much more of a no-code, low-code kind of guy. I like to help power users and general users sort of be good at what they do, generally day-to-day. These days, I'm now a SharePoint and O365 admin adoption specialist. I consult in the DC area, although we work for companies around the East Coast and actually internationally. And in addition to that, I like to do a bunch of other things too. Now that I'm in the DC area, the history nerd portion has been lots of fun, but I've also been making the rounds speaking-wise. So if you're going to be at like a SharePoint TechCon or SharePoint Fest anytime the next probably 6 months or so, I'll probably be there. And if you happen to go into Ignite, I'm not speaking, but I will definitely be there and would love to chat with people in person. Right now, I'm Cloud Services Lead for a company called H3 Solutions. Our company is out of Manassas, Virginia, which is about 40 minutes from DC. So I run the team that goes out and does lots of adoption, migration, get people into Office 365, and we are generally specifically 365 people. We will rebuild custom solutions if necessary, do other kinds of enhancements, search, that kind of thing. But we generally get people off of on-prem systems, especially now that SharePoint 2007 is coming to an end. And I also publish a blog at icansharepoint.com, which unfortunately the branding of that is sort of running its course since we're really in the O365 sphere these days, unless the SharePoint. But I have a nice collection of general everyday user info, best practices, how-to, which is really meant to be a resource for folks that are in the IT, pro, dev, that kind of admin sphere, so they don't have to be reinventing the wheel when it comes to telling users how to do things, because generally speaking, we like to do things that are more technical and maybe not handhold. This can be almost like your internal SharePoint help site as long as you have access to the internet at work. So a little bit more about my background and my story here. So I started out a couple of years, like I said, with the Navy. So I spent 6 years there, and let's see, I had about 15,000 users when I was running the adoption stuff. We had SharePoint 2007, came out in around 2010 for us. We ended up migrating and upgrading really to SharePoint 2013 in the 2014 timeframe. We actually skipped 2010, which was a lesson learned. Never skip SharePoint versions because it's a pain. But I did a lot of the hand-holding. I built a number of internal resources to train people on how to use it. Our old intranet actually got replaced in 2010, but shared drives remained. I supported people from Pearl Harbor all the way that far west, all the way to Derby, England. We had a site there as well, and every time zone in between. People on ships, people that rarely logged into our network, to people that never left me alone. So it was a wide range of stuff. And then a couple of these 5-6 years after that, like I said, I jumped into a new role, which is I spent about 2 years with a healthcare consulting firm in the U.S. Virgin Islands. And what we did there was we actually migrated SharePoint 2013 to SharePoint Online, and that's what this case study is going to be all about. Once we did the migration, not only did I have to be in charge of SharePoint, but I was also in charge then by default of OneDrive for Business, Yammer, getting people on through mobile, their apps on their mobile phones or tablets, and then kind of security fell into that too, which is one of the big lessons learned here, is that when you're moving from SharePoint on-prem to SharePoint Online, you sometimes, if you don't already have an O365 admin, you kind of become the de facto one. So in that situation, let's see, landed a pretty sweet SharePoint upgrade project, because we were in paradise. I mean, there's no better way to put it. I lived on St. Thomas, which is the more populous island in the Virgin Islands of the 3 islands there. Our mission was very specific, but also sort of vague. It was upgrade SharePoint, not necessarily go to the cloud or go to 2016, but do one of those things. And as I go through this case study, I'm going to talk to you exactly about how I went through what the process was of deciding what we should do, how I made the business case, what the risks were, and then I'm going to cover some lessons learned for you also that you can kind of take that away. If there's anybody here that's considering either upgrading to 2016, let's say, or moving to the cloud, or even moving from 2016 to the cloud, I will admit that I am an abashed cloud fan and not so much an on-prem guy these days. But let me give you an overview of actually what I came into. So I started out with a SharePoint 2013 on-prem system. It was me. My title was SharePoint Administrator / Knowledge Manager. I kind of played both the content manager role, but also low-level technical support internally. I did all the architecture work, and I led a team of 3 developers who were offshore. I had some infrastructure support for all the servers and any updates or patching, that kind of stuff. I don't touch that stuff. I've never touched a server in my life. You really don't want me to. So those are the kinds of things that they did. But I led that team. And then we had 4 environments. We had dev, test, staging, and prod, which is pretty standard. But just so you know that when I talk about one system, it was 4 times that space-wise, plus all the backups that we had on locally on premises. And that was about 40 gigs of data that we had for each of those different environments. And then we had some custom solutions, some SharePoint Designer workflows, things like that. It wasn't super heavy, but it was there. So that's important to know because that does we do jump into that a little bit during this session. And so that was sort of where I started. And what came with this system was, so we had some risks here. We had no disaster recovery system, and that's going to be a major part of what I talk about in this situation and why we decided to go to the cloud. But our content management, like many places, was just scattered. I mean, a lot of people had stuff in their shared drives, on their personal laptops, their C drives, their My Documents folders. Some of them were massive. I like to tell people that they are one coffee spill away from losing most of their data. So that was one of the pushes or the adoption, what's in it for me type of outcomes to tell them to really consider moving to OneDrive or to SharePoint. We were generally a Microsoft shop, but we had a few Macs. Not surprisingly, the Macs all came from the marketing department. We also had 4 buildings across 3 campuses. So we were one reasonably small organization, but we were disparate and dispersed across some buildings across the island. And just for reference, we weren't really using anything with respect to enterprise social networking. So we did have Office 365 licenses for everybody when I started, but we just hadn't moved into 365 yet because it was, I believe it came with our contract that we had with Microsoft. So it was one of those, why wouldn't we use it? But very few people had been introduced to the fact that Office.com would bring them to their internal 365 system. So it's not like anybody was playing with Yammer ahead of time. So these are the systems, real quick, on what we were dealing with internally, what we had. So I mentioned we had Office 365. We had E4 licenses for all of the employees. That's since been upgraded to E5. E4 has been retired. We also had Exchange on-prem. We had Dynamics CRM online. And we were using ShareGate Lite to manage SharePoint on-premises, and then we ended up using that to migrate our content online. That being said, ShareGate's a great product. There are a number of other great products out there, like, let's see, AvePoint has a number of products that do this. In fact, they're just rolling out a new one that's sort of a ShareGate competitor, and there are a number of other products out there. But before you ever consider a migration, you need to make sure you know which tool you're going to use to migrate first, because, SharePoint itself does not offer any sort of migration option. So I'm checking in here. Questions. So
we have some questions about the users. Were they all in the Caribbean? If not, where were they situated? And as well, to their data, where was their data all in the Caribbean, or was that elsewhere as well? So
the on-prem system was in the Caribbean. All of our users internally were in the Caribbean. That being said, we had plenty of external users, and a lot of our people traveled very often from St. Thomas to the mainland. Our corporate office was in Boca Raton, so they'd fly to Miami pretty frequently. They also had to go to make site visits at a number of our client locations. The reason we existed, we were a consultant, but really we're a sister organization of a sort of larger healthcare consortium, and the VI offers significant tax breaks if you move to the island and make some capital improvements on the island and a number of other things. But the fact that they traveled regularly meant that they had to VPN into our system. if they needed to get something from the shared drives or from SharePoint. So they had that sort of barrier or barrier of entry, essentially, or annoying barrier of entry to get access to their data, which actually gave them the incentive to keep the stuff on their laptop, which we didn't really want them to do. All right, let's see. Any other questions before I move on quick?
Up ahead, no. There was. We have a question about the ShareGate, but there was nothing else before that.
Sounds good.
ShareGate or MetaLogic, which one suits best?
I am not in the place to say which one, but I will tell you that we used ShareGate on this one, and I'll talk about a couple of the lessons learned. That being said, I guess I'm becoming, I'm buying into a lot of what AvePoint provides, because they also not only provide migration services, but also online governance, like automated governance, essentially backup solutions, because SharePoint Online doesn't offer stuff like that. And then their new sort of light migration tool is called AP Elements. That's coming out soon, or already has come out, and that's a pretty slick program as well. So we had 175 employees, so that's critical to know, which was a major change for me, because now I was looking at employees and basically my users, my colleagues, as individuals and not numbers any longer. Back in the last company, when there were 15,000 users, there's a much different expectation of service. When somebody just calls you up, it's we had a ticketing system. We didn't really use it because it didn't make sense with that few people. Our IT department, our help desk actually made rounds on a daily basis to all the buildings to make sure that everybody was doing okay, and if they needed help. They were really big on customer service in that respect. Not that anybody else that I worked for hasn't been, but. So next step was, okay, that was here's the status quo, this is what I was given to begin with, and then we had to talk about the decision process. So essentially it's a where do we go from here? And the big thing for us was the directive that we were given. We were sort of the playing ground or the proving ground for the sister organization that we worked for. Basically it was, hey, you're smaller, see if you can prove that this new technology, this new tool, this new thing can be good, and if it is, can it be scalable, and if it can be, come to us and teach us how to use it so that we can get efficiency boosted and things like that. Which is why we spoke so much about the cloud, because that was the new big thing. I was talking to Tom a little bit earlier before this started, like 2 years ago-ish, since I came from a classified environment that had an air-gapped SharePoint system, I had never really heard of what Office 365 was. I mean, now I'm neck deep in it all the time, but it was doing that research during this process to figure out, should I move to the cloud or shouldn't I? That was really helping me make the argument that we should move to that because it's the next big thing versus just upgrading to SharePoint 2016 and having to support on-prem systems, hardware, and then deal with all the ramifications that come with that. So we had that directive. We had to do a ton of research. There was a lot of reading. I will say things have gotten significantly better than 2 years ago when I first started this project, because a lot of the content and research and available, posts from Microsoft were very disparate and spread out. They still are to some extent, but they are significantly more centralized these days, so you can get a much better idea of what you're getting for what you're paying for. Then we had to lay out a project plan. So we did that, and we kind of kept it a little bit independent of whether we were going to upgrade to SharePoint 2016 or go to Office 365, basically because we wanted to be able to rebound if we were shot down in the cloud option, so that 2016 is still an option for us to go forward with without too much effort. And then we made the business case to the CIO. I will say it was an interesting process because we were sort of given the directive because I think people were a little bit scared of the term the cloud, that we weren't even able to use the word cloud in our presentations at a C-level or a C-suite level or higher because we didn't want to scare people, even though a number of our applications that we were using already were cloud. The confusion of what that term means, it's vastly wider than you may think it is, because we know what we're talking about in our sphere generally, but the everyday person, and especially people making business decisions or approving funding or approving projects, may not understand the level of security or safety that can come with cloud these days. So we did the business case. I then had to scrub that, so there was a shortened version to make the full-on case to the full cabinet, and we eventually got the okay on that. Then we ran a bunch of test migrations, and then we did the real migration. So you want to make sure that you run a bunch of test migrations ahead of time, see how long it takes, because when you do the cutover from one system to the other, it is a nightmare. It's a logistical pain in the rear end because there's just not a really good way to do it. There are no automatic redirects. The amount of time that it takes, you're going to have to turn the old system off, turn the new system on. You're going to have to do a lot of communication to let people know, like, hey, you're going to be going to this new website. Bookmarks are going to change. Interlinking within files are going to be affected, things like that. Let's see. So I got the question, did I use Planner? No, because I wasn't in Office 365 yet. I don't think Planner was a thing yet at that point. Let's see. I'm working in SharePoint development now for my client. I'm going to perform ShareGate. 300 gigabytes of content. That sounds fun. They dumped some of the CAD files in a repository. So let's see. Outside of SharePoint, so the content database. Yeah, specialized file types are a difficult one. We had to think about that because we had some of those, especially Swarm packages. So if you're familiar with the learning management type of people who push out videos to learning management systems like Cornerstone or similar products like that, they're I think a thunderstorm coming through, so hopefully the power don't go out. Their file types can be a little bit of a pain in the butt, and 2 years ago SharePoint was not as trustworthy. Now that you have the syncing ability through OneDrive, I'm much more confident of putting specialized file types into a SharePoint system or into OneDrive. That being said, sometimes you just need to have that File Explorer experience to open up files, because if you try to open up, say, even like a Photoshop file from SharePoint, if you're just opening the file in SharePoint, it's going to download it, you're going to edit it, and then you're going to have to re-upload it, which kind of, undoes the entire reason of having SharePoint. Now that you have a much better sync client, OneDrive has finally upgraded to OneDrive.exe from Groove.exe, and it can actually sync the SharePoint files. It's significantly better in that respect, but you do want to do some testing. That's where I mentioned the test migrations. Once you have those files migrated, try playing with them. Make sure to give them back to the owners and say, hey, these aren't real, but I need you to try them. Can you open them up? Do they open up in the proprietary software that you're supposed to use? That kind of stuff. All right, let's see. Let's jump back in here. Okay, so why consider the cloud? We talked about this for a long time, and we really wanted to cover the business case. So there were two sides to that coin. One's for the IT side of things. The other is for the user side. But first, let's define the cloud. And I think this is really important because if we're not talking about the same thing, we may not walk away with the same type of information. So I've put together an infographic which I've found really helpful to provide to users especially, but it's also good for IT folks to sort of understand. I have used this infographic in front of clients both on the IT team and in general. But the fact of the matter is, when you look at Office 365, or even if you just ask somebody what they think that is, you can come with me anytime you'd like to any of the SharePoint Saturdays or SharePoint bigger conferences, and if you ask the room, if you're presenting, what is 365, you're going to get a different answer from almost everybody. At the simplest level, some people will say, well, it's just Outlook web app, or I can edit my Excel spreadsheets in the browser. But it is way, 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 way bigger than that. It is all of this stuff. Some of these things are premium products like Dynamics or Visio or Project, but most of them come with what you have. And at first, this might seem overwhelming, but I like to give the introduction of, hey, when you see mail, calendar, people, tasks, that's just Outlook. Those are the same 4 buttons you've had in Outlook since the 90s. When you see Word, Excel, OneNote, PowerPoint, those are the same 4 Office apps that you've had for God knows how long. SharePoint, it should be reasonably familiar to you if you're already using it. Delve is just the MySite profile side of things. OneDrive is just the MySite file hosting side of things. And Skype you've probably been using too, maybe. So not a lot of it, not everything on here is new, so don't let it be too overwhelming. But when I speak of the cloud in the 365 sense, this is what I'm talking about. As sort of an added bonus, if you're looking at Office 365 groups, one thing I like to tell people is if you think you understand Office 365 groups, you have no idea how Office 365 groups work. So this is another infographic I put together to show you how groups work depending on which of the apps you build it in, because there are 3 types of groups. One is Yammer, one is Outlook, and one is Teams. So what you get with one of those, this is useful to have later on. I'm not really covering that in this session, but I did want to throw it out there so that people have it as a resource. And let's see. I have there's a shortened link at the bottom of these two. Also, there's a handout that's going to be going on after this. PDF has the links to all the references and resources that I'm going to reference today, so you'll have the ability to get there. Okay. Let me jump back to PowerPoint quick on my side. Okay, so let's talk about the business case. These were the things that were important to push on the IT side of things. I looked at it from sort of this case. We had inherent disaster recovery, and that for us was by far one of the most important things, because once I upload to the cloud, Microsoft has God knows how many different buildings that keep a copy of my data, so my data is going to be always available to me. We were looking at a disaster recovery system for our SharePoint 2013 system because we didn't have one off island. We actually got a quote for one in one of the buildings that we had server backups stateside in the Chicago area, and it was something like a 7-figure estimate that we got. We would have to actually rent more space because we ran out of rack space. We'd have to get hardware. We'd have to install software. We'd have to run everything, all of that kind of stuff. The other big thing is minimize administration effort. The number of people necessary to run Office 365, even if you include, let's say, email, SharePoint, a number of other things, it's significantly less than what you need to run like on-premises Exchange or on-premises SharePoint, because you have no hardware side of things. There's also no patching downtime because you don't have to do upgrades. The upgrades all come out automatically. They're much smaller. They're more like an app update on your phone, so there's minimal impact there. There are security improvements, and I've had debates on this endlessly with people. I will say I trust an organization that actually makes security its prime directive over some individual who may have gotten an IT degree, 5 years ago. If you're with a company that doesn't support a whole lot of professional development, how is that person supposed to keep up on things and network and find out best practices? So the fact that they have these huge buildings that are, have a number of physical protections, data protections, and others, which I'll get into a little bit later, more specifically what they cover and how, that was a big one for us. From an administrative point of view, this actually centralized all of our stuff under one contract. So that just kind of helped us out because we only had to sign one document moving forward. You have the 3-9 uptime guarantee, so that means 99.9% of the time your system is going to be up and available. I will say when you do the math out on that, it actually comes out to about 8 hours every year. So minus 1 day, you're basically paying for Office 364. Almost no hardware support, which has a lot to do with the administration effort, but other than helping people when they have issues with their mobile devices, things like that, there's no actual hardware for the system itself to work with. Content's wipeable, which is nice, so you can actually control if a user is using their own phone or you have a BYOD policy, you can wipe their content when they leave the company, you can wipe their laptop and provide it to somebody else, or if the person happens to walk away with the laptop, which happens reasonably frequently, you can wipe the sensitive data, and it's much easier to do so from a central admin perspective in 365 than it is to just to do SharePoint and then do Exchange and do all these kind of piecemeal things for on-premises systems. Also kind of slick is that you get an admin app for 365, so you can actually get alerts when your system is down or when new features are available. So if you want to, we had a a draft or a pre-written email alert that I would send out to the company if I ever got an alert from the admin center, which at this point I could probably write a flow to just automate that because Microsoft doesn't communicate to users directly, of course, unless they're pushing out some new feature. So if your SharePoint system is going to go into a read-only mode because they have some sort of issue, they'll let you know, and then it's sort of your responsibility to pass that information on to your users and then let them know when the system is back up and running. It also means that you don't have any control when that's happening, so you're just kind of the messenger, which can be good or bad. One can easily come back and say, this is why we didn't want to go to the cloud, but at the same time, that 3-9 uptime guarantee is still better than any system I've ever actually worked on that was on premises. And you get more features and tools with time. Things update, they come out, new things. Microsoft Teams only came out less than a year ago at this point. Forms came out recently in preview for enterprise licenses. So you're going to get new things as they come along, which means you're getting that many more tools for the license, that much more product for the value. That being said, you do have to keep in mind that you're going to have to communicate these things, and the whole when do I use or which app do I use when thing is going to be a little bit more confusing, but each of these tools sort of have a nuanced application that you should keep in mind and let people sort of play around with. All right, so let me jump back down to Skype quick and see when they will update from 2030 to 2016 on 365.
Yeah, that was pretty much the last question. We had some banter online.
Okay. So 2013 to 2016 on the 365. I'm not quite sure. Avinash, what do you mean by that question? I don't know if you mean SharePoint or if you mean Office itself.
The version, I think, possibly. Yeah.
So SharePoint so when you talk about Office 365, SharePoint Online is SharePoint 2016 plus. So basically, SharePoint 2016 is a snapshot of SharePoint Online, always. So SharePoint Online is always more up to date than SharePoint 2016, except when you get your updates. But even when you get an update that you have to, or a patch, whatever, you'd have to apply to the 2016 on-prem stuff, it's still probably not going to have all the feature sets that would be available in online. So for example, I don't think communication sites, the new sites that were announced back in May, I think, they're now available in SharePoint Online. I could be wrong, but I don't believe that they're available in 2016 yet. So it's always 2016. I guess one could say it's safer because you have more control and you can apply it when you want to, and things don't change as quickly. But your changes are going to be greater than what they would be on online, and you don't have to be stuck with upgrading all that stuff. Alrighty, let me jump back here. All right, so I'm going to talk about inherent disaster recovery. That was the big one for us. Now, if you don't know the geography of the Caribbean, this is what the Caribbean Sea looks like. We have the leeward, or the Greater Antilles are to the left, to the west, and the Lesser Antilles to the right side. And St. Thomas is the one that's circled in green. And actually, from my apartment, I could see Puerto Rico, or at least one of the islands off of Puerto Rico. And it's a beautiful place, don't get me wrong. You might be hearing a little bit more about it right now because of Hurricane Irma. So our big deal with disaster recovery was that we had natural disasters, actual natural disasters. And if you don't recognize this map, this is the history of the last 100 years of hurricane tracks. And you can see the little Google Map drop icon there. That's where St. Thomas is on the map. Now this is from today. This is Hurricane Irma's path as of this morning, and it just got upgraded to a Category 5. It is, I think, the second most powerful hurricane in the Atlantic in recorded history at this point. So, this is very relevant to them right now, and it is for it's not just because this is a small little island in the Caribbean. It's also going to hit Florida. It might hit Louisiana. You're looking at the aftermath of Hurricane Harvey in Houston, in New Jersey, New York. Connecticut, Hurricane Sandy came through and flooded, places that people probably thought would never see water. So disaster recovery is a huge deal, and actual disaster recovery systems for on-prem systems are very expensive. You're basically doubling up what you have. Some places actually do a redundant disaster recovery system just in case. And when you have disaster recovery, it's not going to be a success for you unless you actually test it out, which means you have to take your system offline every so often to make sure that you can run through the steps, your standard operating procedure, all of that stuff. Versus the cloud stuff, you basically just upload it and you don't have to touch it ever again, which is really it relieves a lot of things, both time, effort, and the amount of money that you have to put into this. So you can see that St. Thomas is right. It's actually going to be about 30 miles south of the eye as of right now, and the extent of the storm itself is something like 45 miles. So that's going to be right there. Let's see, were there an existing business continuity plan already in place? There were some, and we were in the process of building out significantly more of them, but SharePoint at the time was not that big of a deal, and it had just become sort of a big deal a few months before I started at that company. So the more people were uploading stuff, it became much more of a communication hub, which then showed people that it could also be a collaboration hub. So it was sort of exploding in that time frame, so we needed to make sure we had a really good backup system for that. So one of the outcomes of a hurricane, this is a real photo from 1995. Hurricane Marilyn came through St. Thomas, and Hurricane Marilyn is one of those life-defining events, the Kennedy assassination or your experience with 9/11. People talk about Maryland to this day, how they were without power on the island for something like 2 months, maybe 2.5 months, and we're not talking a large island. Puerto Rico has, I think, 3 million people. St. Thomas has 50,000, so you're talking a small city size worth of people, and it's, not connected to any of the other islands, really. In 95, there would have been no internet, most likely. Now there is a fiber line that connects to Puerto Rico, and then that connects to the mainland U.S., but that's probably the strongest connection that the BI currently has to the mainland or to Puerto Rico. The other things that pop up are, I did not realize this until I got down there, but the Caribbean plate is actually pretty active seismically. So you get earthquakes. I had my first experience with an earthquake that woke me up. I think it was a 4.5, something like that. So I think I've checked that item off my bucket list now. It was cool enough to say I did it, but not so rocky that it was going to be an issue for me. And when you have earthquakes on an island, you also have tsunamis. So there's actually, this is a real sign, a photo that I took. They show you where to go if there's going to be a tsunami. They have a warning system on the island, and they do tests of those a couple times a year. And just for context, these were the office locations. I said we had 4 buildings on 3 sites. Well, I was in the building that was down to the right, and that was maybe 8 feet above sea level. None of the buildings that we had were maybe more than 50 feet off of sea level. So you had this threat of salt water from the ocean and fresh water from the sky, both of which could be destructive to our systems. So that was a big deal. And as an added bonus, we also had issues with the utilities on the island. So we had one energy company, and we had 2 ISPs. Now, similar to the mainland states, you also had the 2 ISPs were merging. Now, the 2 ISPs are kind of nice because we had redundant systems, and when one was out, the other one always was on. And frankly, the ISPs were more dependable than the energy company, and the cell towers were more dependable than the energy company too. So if your laptop was charged and all of your mobile devices were charged, and you had a phone that could give off a what do you call it? Its own network there, pocket network. You could actually be doing work without having to worry about whether or not you had power. But also, there were plenty of generators. My company had a number of generators set up. There's only so much diesel that somebody can store on property as well, so we had that limitation. So here's some of the horror stories of what WAPA, the Water and Power Authority, which was a figurative and literal 4-letter word, had issues with outages all the time. Happened on both St. Thomas and St. Croix. St. Croix is the other major island in the Virgin Islands. And we had I think it was 2 or 3 day power outage when I was there last summer. And August 9th, 2016 would have been right before we launched or right after we launched the cloud system. So actually that was pretty relevant to us then. So that was the IT side of the business case. I kind of covered the major issues, but also that disaster recovery thing obviously for us was a big deal, which is why I think this case study is kind of cool to give the story on, and also this week, and just, with Hurricane Harvey a couple weeks ago, very, very relevant, and kind of shows how that DR system can be really important to you, even if you didn't think that it would have been. So if it's not on your priority list, it really should be. So you should have a quote for how much that would take to have some sort of business continuity there. If your company doesn't have a business continuity plan overall, they really should. But this kind of checked that box. Just by us doing a test migration, we had a de facto DR system in place that we didn't really have to worry about. So that was kind of a big deal. So then I jump into the business case for the users. So I'm really big on the what's in it for me, that whole with them question. So for users, it's a much different story. For them, I looked at it as, so SharePoint Online, because it's on Microsoft's system, they have provided the opportunity for you to share files externally, outside of your company or outside of your domain. I thought that was going to be an icing on the cake thing, like here's this new collaboration space, it's way better than your shared drives, you get version history, you can all edit stuff at the same time, no more of that so-and-so has this file locked for editing, blah, 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 blah. But no, it turned out external access for a lot of people was the #1 use case for them. They needed to be able to send files to their client stateside, especially for large files. That was a big deal. And having mobile access was also important to them because a lot of them were on the go or on the road a lot. So if they could just bring up a meeting agenda on their phone and not have to open a laptop and try to connect to the Wi-Fi and not be able to connect to the Wi-Fi just to see the meeting agenda, they can have that file available to them on their OneDrive app on their phone and have it downloaded so it was available at all times. And then if they needed to make any changes, it would automatically update the file in the central repository later on once they got onto a Wi-Fi network. It was a really, really great upgrade for them. I saw some notable interest in the video portal. At the time, it was the Office 365 video portal. Now it's Stream. Now, both exist currently, but Stream is replacing the video portal. And if you're not aware, Microsoft is actually going to migrate all content from the video portal to Stream in the background. They should give you a heads up when they do that. I believe that's happening this month, if not in October, which I don't understand or know how they're going to deal with, like, if somebody has a channel in the video portal and somebody has a similarly named or identically named channel in Stream, how they're going to do that overlap. But it's good for you to know if you didn't already know that, because Stream is the new video portal and it is taking over from the Office 365 video portal, which was really just a SharePoint library that was the UI was changed. The other big deal for us was no VPN required. So if you were off island, you didn't have to VPN in. You could just log in. That was a big deal. That got rid of that unnecessary hurdle to get in. And then huge file size support. At the time, it was 10 gigabytes. Now it's 15 gigabytes for SharePoint and OneDrive. That also applies to the video portal, which is kind of cool because I had a couple use cases where people were just trying to send large files to their client, and they were literally talking about overnight mailing an SD card, which I feel like in the 2016, 2017 timeframe should be unnecessary. So this worked out really well in those cases. People have also shown a real interest in the fact that they get 5 licenses to Office. So you get Office Pro Plus usually with a 365 account, or with an account or license, depending on the level, the license type of Office, but generally it's Pro Plus. And you get that. That's across desktop, tablet, and mobile. So you can have Office on full-on Office on your work computer, but you could also install it at your home on your home PC. You can have apps on your phone or on your iPad or any Android device, which would probably include Kindles, I think. So a lot of people have seen that as a real win because they don't have to purchase the personal version for home, which is like $150, something like that. Let's see, for SharePoint Online disaster recovery, did you have to use any third-party products or did Microsoft provide services to meet your needs? Let's see. No, so disaster recovery for me really meant that I had a backup someplace, or I didn't have to worry about putting a backup system in place, so that if my system had been destroyed, say, by a natural disaster, I still had that data. When it comes to like restorations and things like that, I will talk a little bit about that later in the session, but the long story is the restoration process for SharePoint Online is subpar at this point, in my opinion, but there are plenty of services out there. AvePoint has a backup and restore option that you can get for your 365 system, and I think it covers not just SharePoint, but others as well. All right, let me jump back to here. Let's see, improved user interface. So you're talking about the most updated version of these apps at all times. So the UI will be changing as feedback comes through. No patching or downtime for upgrades, which is kind of nice. So like when I did my team and I did a patching operation on Christmas Day back in 2015-ish because we knew nobody would be using the system, but we did communicate, hey, if you happen to need a file, please don't expect it to be there. We're going to be upgrading that system. So it only took us a few hours, but yeah, that's kind of nice that there is no notable impact on any sort of upgrade downtimes. I have had a few times where I've seen warnings about a potential freeze put on SharePoint Online, but it's usually for an hour or less. They usually tell you a little bit about what they're doing, and it's also usually localized based on where your system or where your data is kept. So if you're in one of the data system or the data centers, like in the U.S., it would let you know that. And it is generally localized. They tell you, or they identify you based on where you are and whether you would actually be affected. So that's a good thing. Let's see, OneDrive for Business. I will say the week after we offered, or we upgraded or migrated to SharePoint Online and launched it, our OneDrive for Business usage doubled. Within 5 days, we went from like 5 gigs to 10 gigs of space being taken up. It had everything to do with the fact that there is now a button to OneDrive in the waffle. So I had a number of people asking me, hey, how can I sync this? Or I heard that I could sync this, so I got them all through the process of installing OneDrive on their laptop so they could actually have the files synced to their hard drives and have them accessible whenever they needed to. Talk to them about the difference between OneDrive and SharePoint. OneDrive is really meant for your stuff. SharePoint is really meant for team stuff. At least the team sites, and then the publishing space, which we had an intranet, that was meant for everybody. So that was a good learning opportunity. So if people really wanted to start using OneDrive and they wanted my advice, they had to sit down and listen to my whole spiel, which meant that I had that much more adoption, that much more understanding of the governance, that kind of thing. So they almost had to buy off my leaving their desk by listening to my spiel. Delve is pretty cool. Expertise location is similar to my site, so you can talk about your projects, your skills, things like that. You also get they also provide discovery now, which I know Microsoft is pushing really, really hard. They think it's this cool thing. I'm skeptical, not in a bad way, but like the whole discovery thing, I'm not really seeing how it's going to help me do my daily job. I haven't really seen a use case for it yet myself. But the fact that it connects to Microsoft Graph in the background and shows people based on how you're related to them, whether not just in the org chart or the managerial hierarchy, but also in who you email regularly, who edits the same files as you. It's kind of cool in that respect, but I will give you fair warning that people do look at that as Big Brother, and sometimes they're concerned about like, well, if I work on a file and it pops up and my manager sees that I'm working on that, what happens then? It's a legitimate concern. People in our field will say, well, that's just showing off that there's a permission issue and you have to fix that, which, yeah, one can say that, but sometimes there is, security through obscurity in the real world. You can turn off Graph in some ways, but it has impacts on other systems elsewhere, so you have to think that one through, and there are a couple really good blog posts out there about what that implies. and not just from the Microsoft, this is what the technical implication is going to be, but also from some people in the field that are, this is what's actually going to affect how people do their jobs. But Delve is pretty cool. I will say, so the Delve app is nice on your phone, but I will say my favorite app at this point is the OneDrive app, and that's because it shows you all of your files, regardless of whether it's in OneDrive, whether it's going through Delve, whether it's going through SharePoint, and it'll actually open up those files, and if it's a Word file, it'll open it up in the Word app, Excel app, and then if you know that you have to look at a couple recent Excel files, if you just open up the Excel app, you can see your recent files. Frankly, to me, recent files is the most important list of files that I could ever have, because those are the ones that are most relevant to me at a given time, versus Discovery and Delve just seems like it's trying to solve a problem that I don't think is there. But that's my opinion. I have not seen, I'm sure there are others who have seen some serious usage of that. I just have not seen the need for it yet. So once I do, I look forward to actually applying it. Okay, so that was the business case. So you had that kind of half side, one half for the IT folks, the other half for the users. And frankly, I think there are just so many benefits to both sides that it's a real win-win for both IT, management, people who are paying for these systems, all that kind of stuff, and then the users, because they really want that experience that they're so used to on systems like Facebook, Google Drive, Gmail, that kind of thing. So if anybody's using stuff like that, they would expect the same level of functionality to be coming from the enterprise. Microsoft Office and Office 365 are the gold standard of the productivity software suite, worldwide at this point. That being said, there are risks. So you really need to understand what those disadvantages are. They're not trivial, but I think they're easy to overcome, and you just need to know about it when you go into it. So for me, the big ones are, number one, custom solutions, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. Keeping up with changes, because things change very frequently. You're supporting more than one system now. If you're a SharePoint admin, you're now probably going to be a de facto Office 365 admin. You're going to have to produce an SLA document that shows your colleagues what is being covered and what's not. You have to decide whether you provide access to all of the apps that 365 give you, or do you cut back and then roll them out one every month, do an app of the month type of thing. Do you trust your users to play, or might they go off and make a mess and break something that they didn't realize they shouldn't have broken? That means you have to have more governance. So from the planning side of things, you have to really do that out. But then from the adoption side of things, it can be a little bit more fluid and not be so worried about how, issues like you would see like with SharePoint. Performance might be slower, and I think that this is one people don't want to talk about very much. But if you're on a LAN or you have a T1, line going through your building, your performance to an on-prem system is going to be significantly faster, more than likely, than it would be to the internet. So you do have to run some performance tests. We did that. We did some pings to our system, pings to their system, and we kind of reported out that that one was, I think for us it was like 12% slower, something like that for SharePoint Online, but we determined that that was acceptable for the cost-benefit analysis that we're looking at and for what people are going to get, because just the access via tablet and mobile alone, even if it was going to be slower, it was still going to be better. Plus, you could do syncing, so if you had the files on locally to your hard drive, opening those up was going to be faster. When it came to intranet work, yep, it might be a little bit slower, but we felt that it was definitely worth it. And then external sharing. I love it. People that understand it love it. It is so confusing, and it is not just some ad hoc thing that you can do. In this specific reference, I'm using SharePoint Online as what I'm referencing, because you can actually build an extranet, essentially, with other users that aren't even Office 365 users. And, I mean, theoretically, and this is being recorded, but still, theoretically, you could actually run one 365 account, or one tenant with one 365 account on it, and just invite a bunch of external people. They're going to have almost every ability to do everything they want on SharePoint for free. No 365 system necessary. Now, they wouldn't get OneDrive for Business. They wouldn't get the video portal. They wouldn't get a lot of other stuff. They wouldn't be able to use Teams, at least not yet. But the fact of the matter is, like, you could build your own little collaboration extranet if you wanted to on a Microsoft system, and it's that's pretty cool. But to get there, you have to get over this initial hump. There is definitely a barrier of entry to this, which comes down to training for your users, showing them how to do it, showing them what the people that they're sharing with would see and experience, because they don't really think about that. They just think about just do it and it's going to work, and in many cases it doesn't. And then the last and biggest one is security. So I'm going to cover each of these independently here. For custom solutions, you have to develop within the parameters that Microsoft sets. I'm talking more specifically in SharePoint in this respect. If you want to start playing with Flow and Power Apps, which I think are really, really cool new applications that are providing really good sort of out-of-the-box no-code, low-code options and can be more adapted to by everyday users or power users, so you don't have to be a developer, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking SharePoint. So if you have internal legacy applications that you really need to see roll over into SharePoint Online, you have to start working on those and put those into your project plan. Depending on your sort of addiction to those applications, you may have to look at your budget or your time, planning budget, all that kind of stuff. The migration itself might be the short part. That might be the easy part. And unfortunately, we did experience where the parameters, Microsoft legitimately moved the goalposts on us during our dev process. We were actually putting together a custom global navigation bar. We believed we were following their parameters. We still believe that. And then one day, like 2 weeks before we launched, it stopped working. We looked it up. There was a change. It turned out that change was what had affected us. So we weren't very happy about that. But that being said, I've worked on other projects since where we've done plenty of JavaScript, Bootstrap, that kind of work and applied it to an SPO system, and they work out very well. But I also very much am a try to use the tools that come with 365 out of the box. If you want to build some sort of, user directory or something like that, try to use, search query instead of developing some hardcore thing, or just use Delve. But it depends on how you feel about your users. If you think they're a little bit reluctant to deal with change, then you may not want to be pushing Delve out so quickly. But Delve is a pretty good product, and it works nicely. If you have some sort of, this is what I generally see, is not just a user directory, but an org chart. There still is no good built-in org chart app built into Office 365. There is sort of a low-scale org chart that comes with Delve, presuming that your management hierarchy is correct in your Active Directory, but it's still not a nice little printout of, like, here's this department, here's that department, here are their phone numbers, that kind of thing. So if you do have some sort of custom solution like that, which is one of the more common ones that I see, you may have to rebuild it. Or I would always say, from my viewpoint as a consultant, I will always push back and say, please, confirm to me or confirm to yourself that you really believe that you need this. Okay. So some of your custom solutions will have to be rebuilt. Some won't work at all, and you have to decide: is it worth keeping the on-prem system to support that app, which kind of defeats the purpose if you're looking really to go to the cloud. Why would you continue to upkeep an on-prem server? Why would you keep upgrading the software on it? Or if it's something that you built on 2010, SharePoint 2010, like would you leave 2010 in place until 2020 or 2023 just because you don't want to upgrade that to 2016 or SharePoint 2019, which I believe is the next one? So even then, you're still going to have to rebuild it. So you have to consider these all as you go through this process. All right, so I just heard a question. Let's see, can we extend machine learning capabilities in SharePoint Online easily? So machine learning applicability that I'm aware of right now is within sort of Delve, I guess, and I would generally see it in Teams, so especially with using the bots. I don't know applicability in SharePoint Online. I have to talk to somebody who is a little bit more geeky in that realm than I am. So I will say my company right now is pushing out a new bot for Teams. If you haven't played with Teams yet, it's pretty cool. But the fact that bots are available, we actually built a bot that you can train using Microsoft Flow. So effectively, we have wikified sort of the bot paradigm, because before bots had to be developed by developers and bot framework experts kind of thing. Well, we just basically gave you the bread and you can put the meat and veggies in it and make your sandwich, and you can basically train it to do all of your business processes just using Flow through connectors to outside places, things like that. So I think that's pretty cool. All right, let me jump to the next item. So keeping up with changes is the next big thing. It is a very difficult process to stay on top of all this. Like I said, 2 years ago or so, the information was significantly more disparate than it is today, but it is still very disparate. The different teams at Microsoft, even within Office, post in different locations. So some of them post their announcements to the Office blog, some post to the Microsoft Tech community, some of them post to TechNet still, some post to other places. Then you have some of the big ticket names within each of those departments or organizations that are active on Twitter and post some of their announcements there. They will speak at SharePoint conferences, so that's important as well. Frankly, I think it makes this process very difficult for Office 365 admins to keep up with things. Oh, and I don't even have on here, the Admin Center has a message center built in. Now, I will say I'm not the biggest fan of it right now because it's, I wish I could categorize or filter and sort based on the application that's being affected. Right now, you can only do it based on some other arbitrary category systems that I don't really ever care about. But so you have to keep up on your specific tenant's message center. You have to follow the Office blog. Office also has a YouTube channel where they publish a monthly, this is what's updated in the last month type of thing. And a lot of the times their announcements will say, this is going to start rolling out next week, and they won't say when it'll finish rolling out. So I usually ping them and be a bit of a thorn in their side and say, when's this going to finish? And I get the response of, we're not sure, probably 3 weeks. Which I find to be very frustrating because I always give back the feedback of, well, imagine if I told my CIO during a project planning session that we might be done next week or we might be done 4 weeks from now. That's essentially what they're saying. Now, I understand that the rollout process for them, because their data centers are so large and there's just so much content to roll out these systems onto, or these updates onto these systems, but at the same time, I'm really a strong proponent of them getting, actual dates in line so that I can tell my users, hey, this thing, for example, what most recently changed in SharePoint Online was how to share a link. That user interface changed. It's an upgrade. It's a very beneficial change, I will say. But when that happened, I had a number of emails, comments, Skype messages came into me, and it was like, oh, I didn't even know that that happened. So it's that kind of thing where you may think it's like a minimal thing and a minimal UI change, but when it's something that people use on a day-to-day basis and they notice that it changes, they're going to ask about it. Any specific issues we need to be aware of with workflow solutions? So SharePoint Designer still works. You're not going to ever get a new version of SharePoint Designer. 2013 is and will be the last version. It's supported until 2026. For reference, so is InfoPath. So I am not telling people that they should avoid InfoPath or SharePoint Designer at this point, and some people will scoff at me, and they have, and I say, well, if you have a 9-year plan for your IT department, I'd love to see it, and of course nobody can produce that. So SharePoint Designer still works for workflow, absolutely. That being said, I generally don't give SharePoint Designer to anybody outside of IT or specifically outside of my SharePoint team because I've actually seen an entire network go down for a week because of SharePoint Designer in the hands of somebody who shouldn't have had it because they just weren't trained well enough in it. So the fact that you have Flow now out of the box gives you much more. It's a very Nintex-like product where it's drag and drop. You can do your if-thens, all that kind of stuff. It's a really slick product, and people can actually use it. And they have templates and things like that you can just apply. If you haven't ever gone to the Flow site, you'll see the sort of Flow store. And I think still the #1 most popular flow is send me a notification on my phone when my manager emails me, which I think is kind of funny that that's like what people who use Flow think is the most important thing. But there are a bunch that you can run with and start off from. So SharePoint Designer is still an option, but I would say if you want to give people more of if you want to democratize the workflow process, start introducing Flow to people, let them know what it does, show them some examples, and let them see what the templates are like. But your SharePoint Designer workflows, I don't know if they'll migrate over completely, but you can at least rebuild them. I have not seen any issues where SharePoint Designer workflows don't work. So. Yeah, so Tom says he agrees. Start using Flow if you can. All right, so the next one is you're supporting more systems. And if you don't remember that chart, this is now what you own. Okay, so you have the ability to turn them off, turn some things off. It's not the easiest process for some of them. But for the most part, if you have an enterprise E3 or 5 license, you're going to get almost all of these things. Nothing with a $sign. You won't get those, and you won't get bookings and Staff Hub on the bottom right because those are for small businesses. But you're going to get almost everything else, and you have the option to sign up for first release. So if you want to see apps that come out before they're generally available, you can do that. You can do that by the user, so like the O365 admin and maybe some testers in IT. Get access to that file or that app ahead of time before the rest of the company, or you can be on first release for everybody. So everybody will see one of those things happen and roll out. But you're now sort of an owner of all of these things. And you'll note that I don't like have Exchange called out on here because that's not an application that users use. That's the server that supports Outlook. But if you end up migrating to Exchange Online, that's that much more that you're going to have in 365 and that you have to be an owner of. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. Performance might be slower. Like I said, on-prem systems are likely to be faster due to a direct connection. So just make sure to do some performance testing before you make the move. All right, and then the last of the first 5, I guess, before I talk about security, is external sharing. So I actually cover an entire separate presentation on this topic itself. It's that complex. So it's like half from the admin side, you have to set it up correctly. You have to make the strategic decision to make it available. And how available do you make it? Do you make it so that anybody can see a file or a folder? Do you make it so that only O365 users can do it? Do you make it anonymous? You know, to that level, it's and then it's confusing for users if they don't know what the rules are that you've put in place. It's also by site collection, which I will say SharePoint Online is much more site collection organized now. So like for Office 365 groups, if you create a group, you get a SharePoint site collection with it. Microsoft is very much in the breadth, not depth. So you're not going to have site, subsite, subsite, subsite sort of hierarchies any longer. You can still move and migrate subsite hierarchies to SharePoint Online from an on-prem system, but generally speaking, Office wants you to stick to individual site collections for different sites, which actually makes sense moving forward because you'll want to keep in mind that backup and restoration options, if you want to do that, they're actually by site collection level. You can't just restore a library or an item or a list or a site. You actually have to restore the entire site collection. So if your entire intranet, for example, is in one site collection and somebody super important like your CIO loses or deletes a file way back when and somehow it doesn't end up in the recycle bin and he just demands that you have to do a restoration, you're going to have to call Microsoft, they're going to have to come in, they're going to do it, and you're going to have to restore that site collection back to wherever it was when your CEO lost that file. So that is very important to note because you might be putting a lot of people back in that process because your organizational structure, your architecture is based on site and subsite, not site collection. Let's see. Now per site collection, not tenant. For restore, is that what you mean, Tom?
The external sharing, yeah, I thought it was per tenant a while back, but it looks like it's per
So it's you have 3 or 4 switches that you have to deal with. The first one is turning it on per tenant, and then you get to choose in each site collection which level of sharing you want to provide.
Okay, got it.
Which is why this is that much more annoying. That being said, the handout that I have for this, because you're not going to want these slides. You're going to want the information in these slides. I actually have all of the information on the external sharing session appended at the end. So if you want to look at that information, feel free. All right. Okay, so let's talk about the big one, which is security. This is the one that everybody is going to tell me that they just don't, trust the cloud at this point. And I come back at this not to be, total smart aleck, but for this case study, we were actually already using a number of cloud products, whether or not people knew it. We had these ones, for example. We were using Dynamics CRM online. So we were already using Office 365, technically. We had sort of a competing content management app called Alfresco. We had an organization that was using Evernote, and our LMS, our learning management system, was in Cornerstone. All of these are cloud services options. And then even more importantly to me, I guess, and then probably to most people on an individual basis, Concur is how we did all of our expense reporting. So whenever I needed to get paid back for work travel, I think, to me, my money is more important to me, in that situation than sometimes my data. And even more importantly about that, ADP, all my vacation time was recorded in there, and all my paychecks came from there. So that's a pretty important piece of data to me. And if they trust going to the cloud with that, I think they should trust their enterprise level data as well. And these companies are also, nothing to say, no disrespect to any of the other companies, but ADP is a big company now. It's not Microsoft. Cornerstone and Concur are big companies at this point. They're not Microsoft, right? So these are even smaller organizations that you are taking even, I think, more risk going with a smaller organization who may not have the infrastructure or the expertise available to keep the security at the same level that Microsoft can offer, I believe. And then if you need to get into that argument internally, some of these are also very popular cloud apps. So Box and Dropbox are file sharing apps. Google Apps for Work is file sharing, but also a competitor to 365 in general. Trello is a project management tool. Hootsuite and MailChimp are very popular among marketing individuals. Salesforce is the Dynamics competitor. It's one of the biggest CRM systems out there right now. And then Slack is a competitor now for Teams. But these are all cloud products. So if they're using them, they already have given into the whole security thing. So I think that's important to keep in mind. Let's see. For tracking external sharing on mobile devices, did you have to use Enterprise Mobility Suite? Let's see. Is this the session associated with external sharing? So to Chrissy, that's kind of sort of that, yes, but it doesn't. That's much more on the user level, and then the notes that I have for this one will have more of the admin stuff. For the Enterprise Mobility Suite, I did not use that. There was another guy in the company who was our security guy, and we were so small that he was doing both physical security and IT security in our company. He was in charge of putting Intune out, so we actually had people sign into Intune to install applications on their phone. So they couldn't just go into the App Store and download Word, for example, or OneDrive. They had to go through Intune, which gave us the ability to wipe a little bit better. But I don't know how we did external sharing with mobile devices. I guess I didn't think that there was any difference. And there might be, and it might be a change since I used it last, because I haven't really touched that in a little while with any of my clients that I currently have it. I haven't had a specific request for any sort of mobile device implication there. But yeah, you'll definitely want to look at an Intune for that. So continuing on with security stuff, this was the next biggest issue I had pop up, was people just said, we just assume we're not going to own the data. And that's just not true. The data is yours. Microsoft specifically says that. Frankly, it's in their best interest to just play middleman because they don't want to have any legal implications for something that you might have uploaded. The other big thing was, oh, well, they'll probably data mine and advertise. That's also not true. You get no advertising from this. It's not like Gmail that will hit you up with some ad based on an email somebody sends you. There's also no data mining, at least not one that you would see on your end. Then the other one was they can access their stuff, and yeah, I mean they can. It's in their system theoretically, but it would be a huge breach of their contract. They're basically saying we'll keep your data, but we're not going to do anything with it. And they like to make the point out the fact that it's sort of, I'll use the comparison to like, launching a nuclear bomb kind of thing. You have to have two people turning the key at the same time, and the keys are far enough away that one person couldn't turn them at the same time. There is no way for one person to get into this data unless they are given the key code that you would provide to get it in. So that's important to note. So there's a lot of, physical and digital layers of security that are in place. And importantly, they're not going to access your information unless they're requested by law enforcement. So that's either going to be local law enforcement, a FISA court, which if you've never heard of a FISA court, or, well, I think it's much more popular or notable these days since the Edward Snowden revelations, because FISA is what is the classified court that reviews whether or not the NSA can ask for personal information or identifying information, things above the level of metadata. And then national security organizations can ask for this too. Now, I'm not a lawyer. I'm not getting into the whole I'm providing you legal advice here, but there is a lot to read about this stuff. So if security is an issue that's popping up with you, you may want to bring in legal counsel and review this stuff. But then there are plenty of companies out there that just say, nah, I'm not worried about it because this is no different than if I were to go with Google Apps probably. So when a law enforcement request does come in, though, just for your information, a warrant or court order is required. So this isn't just like, hey, we're just going to knock on the door and say we want this stuff. And sort of some numbers here, they had almost 36,000 requests in the first half of 2016. Only 2.5% were granted. So that means a judge in this case for most of these situations, 97.5%. Somebody said no, so that was notable in that respect. And then for the FISA and the NSL requests, these are significantly more secret. You're not probably going to know that they're happening unless they specifically call you out. They gave you a range here for that first half of 2016 that there were up to 500 requests over about 18,000 different accounts. And just makes me chuckle here that, I worked in a classified setting for a while. There's no way that these numbers have to be that secret, but, they're apparently so secret that they have to give them out in ranges and not actual numbers. But that's good to know. Microsoft doesn't hide the fact, we can hand over Office 365 data without your permission if it comes up to that point, but it's so infrequent and so unlikely that you'd have to be doing some seriously bad stuff or be integrated or talking with some seriously bad people out there. And I'm sure the whole, if you have nothing to hide, show what you got, by all means go ahead. If you do have nothing to hide, show that. The other thing, too, is that Microsoft actually sued the U.S. government over this issue in April 2016, which I should really look into what the update about that was. I'll play the cynic a little bit here. I was involved with, government and local elected boards and whatnot for a while. I'm sure it's not very expensive for Microsoft to put some lawyers on this and sue the government, regardless of what the outcome will be, and it looks good, so the PR is actually pretty cheap. But that being said, I do believe that they push this in a good direction that the government needs to be pushed back on, because they shouldn't just be able to go through your stuff. That being said, the argument came up when I was going through this, well, they could just go into it, and I said, well, what's the difference between that and hacking into at this point it's a hack. You're legitimately talking about government hacking. And what's stopping them from going into our servers, and our servers are also connected to the internet? No offense to the guys that are doing security at our company, but why are they any better, or maybe they're worse or not as well experienced as the folks that are actually putting this Microsoft stuff to work? So if you're assuming that you could actually have your information accessed illegally, it means that Microsoft is either in on it or the government is hacking into it, which you really can't stop anyway. So it's one of those, what's the difference? 6 one, half dozen the other. That being said, you really do have a lot of work to do. If you're concerned about security, you should probably call up your lawyers on this, your attorneys internally, or if you have somebody on retainer, take a look at that. There's a lot of resources you can read that are actually in reasonably human language. These are listed out here. So the 365 Trust Center, the security overview from the Office blog. Customer Lockbox is essentially sort of like a Bitcoin system. So they can give you a key that opens up your content, and they will only be able to open it up if you provide it. But if you lose it, you are totally out of luck. So I'm not sure I believe in that one, because there's no real check or balance there on who owns that key code and what happens if that person leaves and loses it or something like that. But in the handout that I have for this, there are links to all of these, so you can check them out and read through them. You should be reasonably familiar on that. And I'll point out one more thing on security. I'm really big on the whole practice what you preach, which I am a very strong user of 365. My company just recently moved completely to Microsoft Teams, and we're pushing Teams as a nice collaborative solution to our clients. So we shouldn't just be saying that it's good, we should know that it is. I think it's notable that Microsoft actually moved 98% of its SharePoint system to the cloud, including, as they called it, sensitive product and financial information. And there's a link right there to their white paper. Their white paper is actually a really good read. I have rarely seen Microsoft produce any sort of documentation that shows how their internal workings actually work. And the only stuff that they left on premises were basically legacy software, legacy applications, or any sort of custom solutions. So you can check that out. When you go to that link, it does download a PDF immediately because it goes straight to Microsoft's press release repository thing. So don't be scared. I'm not trying to send you a Trojan or anything like that, but I think it is a notable thing to acknowledge. Let's see. Oh, yes, or the Russians. This is true. It may not be my own country. That's right. It might be somebody on the opposing side. Okay, so some lessons learned. Let's talk a little bit about what I walked away from knowing that I will now not have to relearn. For big thing here, special characters are different depending on which version you're using, so you have to be aware of what you're migrating. Sometimes special characters will break during the migration, so there are migration tools that will allow you to replace those special characters. I have an infographic out there that shows which special characters are covered by which versions of SharePoint, but I only go back as far as 2010 because 2007 is so much different. Checked out files. If you have files that are checked out, essentially most migration tools, there are exceptions, but I forget which ones off the top of my head. Most migration tools will miss checked out files because they're essentially not visible to anybody but the person that is actually owning that file. So you do have to make sure to either tell people to check in the files, or you might have to upgrade the version of your migration tool to. It's usually a premium sort of service that those things include. Missing users. If somebody leaves the company, they are you'll still see their name pop up in version history if that file is a few years old, let's say. So when you do migrate, you usually migrate the users first so that they exist in 365 and they're available. This is okay whether you're using Active Directory on premises or if you're using Azure Active Directory. You can, it doesn't. Actually, most of my experiences so far have been Active Directory on-prem, and AAD essentially pings AD on-prem to confirm all the users. That being said, if your users don't exist at the migration time, you have to essentially create a dummy user. So I like to call it like migration person or migration, account to fill in or backfill in all those users who would no longer be there, which does kind of affect your configuration control of files, I guess. But I think it's worth it in that respect. I don't know a better solution. I mentioned earlier restorations are by site collection. So that example where the CEO loses a file. You have to go through Microsoft. There's no other way to do that at this point, unless you want to buy an add-on product. So something like AvePoint provides a cloud-based backup solution. It actually keeps all the content still in Azure, so you're never leaving the security realm of Azure, but you still have to purchase something premium. And then wow, do things change fast. It does. You really have to keep up on this. At this point, with my clients, I actually send out emails to all my clients that I've worked with. I'm sort of the information source for them because I'm going to know it anyway. So, for them having paid me for a service at some point, I'm going to keep them up to date. But it's hard to do it. It's hard to keep up sometimes. You do have to check so many different places. Another big deal is Exchange Online mailboxes are required to use Office 365 groups, which that impacts Planner, that impacts Teams, that impacts Stream to an extent, SharePoint also. So we were really excited to use groups. Come to find out that our on-prem Exchange system would not support it, which was actually a nightmare because we had to turn Planner off because you could actually create a plan in Planner, and that creates a group whether you want it or not. And if you saw that group in Outlook on the web, which you very well would, and you tried to click any of the tabs that were related to the Exchange, the shared mailbox, or the shared calendar, you would get a bunch of errors up with no explanation as to why. So it was a very, very non-slick way of dealing with that. So you do have to keep that in mind. You don't necessarily have to migrate to Exchange Online, but you do have to at least offer mailboxes for the users and that are going to use it, and for the shared accounts. A couple other things, especially on the user side here. Login is now a must, which is kind of annoying to people. Most people are used to just opening up their browser and their intranet is there. Now you have to log in through the 365 login page. I always tell people to just leave their browser open during the day, because if you close your browser and go back to the same website, it's going to ask you to confirm your address or your identity again. It won't ask for your password if you have it remember it, and frankly, it usually pulls it from Windows anyway, which is kind of nice. But it is really annoying that you can't just get into the internet any longer. It's a security feature, it's not a bug, and I like to tell people that, but I will acknowledge that it's kind of annoying. There's no really good way to redirect old sites or my sites that I'm aware of without paying. Maybe there are some super premium products that will do that, but you can't just have, like, if you're going to the My Site for my account, for example, I can't just have it redirect automatically to the Delve page, for example, of where you would live on the cloud. And old sites, I generally go through and take the top 10 sites that are accessed, and I'll put some JavaScript in there where it will automatically redirect after 10 seconds, and it has in big red letters, this no longer exists, go someplace else. So I think that's important to keep in mind too. Let's see. SMS alerts aren't supported, so if you are a big user of alerts, I love alerts. SMS text messages were supported in SharePoint 2013. They might be in 2016, I don't remember. But I had a request for this at this company when I was working for them to have SMS alerts pop out, and they're still available and showing in the alert option, but they're grayed out, and there's just no way to turn them on. And I don't know when the SharePoint team plans on removing that, because it's really not nice that they would make it seem like all I have to do is set it up. But at this point, that whole notification on your phone thing, that flow template to get a notification when your boss emails you, that was the use case actually for this type of thing. So that would have worked if they wanted to keep it that. Can't remove apps from the waffle. I have an asterisk there. It's not that you can't do it. It's just annoying and difficult. The best and easiest way to do it is just to remove licenses to those individual apps, but some apps don't have licenses to remove, so you're stuck with them. You can run some PowerShell to remove them. I don't PowerShell, sorry to say. You should not trust me with PowerShell. So you can do it, but you do have to run it through, and then it takes a little time to get them up to date. Adding apps to the waffle is supported. So if you want to have a link that goes like your intranet homepage, so a specific SharePoint page, or even an outside one, if you want to have a link to ADP or something, you can do that. But you do have to push it out there. And you'll note in the waffle there's actually 3 tabs. One is Home, New, and All. Well, it's kind of like All is your app store, and Home is your home screen on your phone. So I can't, as an admin, push a tile to the Home tab of some user. The user has to agree to do it themselves, which I think is very annoying. So that's important to note. Let's see. Yeah, but I find my added waffle shortcuts show up inconsistently, and the users need to add them to their waffle and make it available. Yeah, correct. So that's what I was just saying. Under another app. I haven't had that issue where you said the waffle will show up, or the tile will show up under SharePoint, but not under another app. Right now, like one of my clients, we added a custom icon and for the branding we had for the new intranet, and that's now one of their tiles. I do find sometimes the waffle doesn't it takes a second for it to load my personalization. So if I have some buttons larger than others or reorganized, it can sometimes take a second, which is inconsistent and annoying. But I think the waffle is always being played around with a little bit. So it will be nice though when we can actually force this stuff, because frankly I shouldn't have to ask a user to change, like to basically install an app from an app store. There's really no better way to describe how they're doing that. And then the other really big thing here is change management communication aren't just part of the process, they are the process. So make sure when you're doing this, you put together a governance team, you include them in the processes so they have some ownership to it, make them actually do some work. They'll then have more buy-in if they understand exactly how these things work. It's a tough process, but it is a very rewarding process to make sure that that happens. So that's essentially the sort of case study here. This is what the area in the VI looks like on a beautiful day with Irma coming through tomorrow. It's going to be a little bit crazier. I will say from the ending viewpoint here, I told you earlier it was me and 3 full-time people. At the end of this process, it was me and 1 full-time admin developer. And then we had an on-call guy who we ended up using, like, after the first month, we used him for 0 hours moving on. And we had no infrastructure support necessary any longer. So we literally cut down our personnel expenses in half. So for me, the conclusion was it was worth moving to the cloud. I generally am a big proponent of just push into the cloud and don't worry about it. It's not worth it. I know some people will say, well, what about our jobs? You know, which I totally understand. That's a reasonable thing to say. That being said, in all the organizations I've worked with so far, those people were not like removed. It's not like they got laid off because they were no longer necessary. They got reapplied to different projects, things that had been on the back, on the back burner for IT for years, which I have yet to see an IT department that doesn't already have things on the back burner for years. So it's been kind of cool because those people have gotten the opportunity to now learn new dev languages or new systems that they hadn't played with before, and they have SharePoint and Office 365 under their belt and can help out, and you have that many more people that are able to help out or evangelize, that kind of thing, but you also give them some opportunity to professionally develop into something they may turn out to like even more. So I'm going to call it a day at that one. I will be happy to take any more questions, comments, discussion, that kind of thing. And the handout is at that URL that you see right there. And then I'm also posting that on Twitter and LinkedIn, and I'll have some my contact info at the end here. Also, I just want to make sure, too, that you guys know that I have a feedback form out there. So if you don't mind, like even right now, if you want to type that into your browser, it's actually a real-world example of using Microsoft Forms, which is kind of cool. So you can go to this link, submit that, because I really want to know how I can make this better, especially as this is a pretty popular session, so I want to make sure I'm giving the best that I can when I do it. And then when it comes to contacting me, that's the Twitter account that I use and the LinkedIn address. If you guys are interested in any sort of consulting or even just quick guidance, that kind of thing, feel free to get a hold of me. I would not step into this by yourself because you can definitely save a lot of steps if you have somebody that knows what they're doing. Not saying it has to be me, but it definitely does help out. So I'm going to jump back to Skype now quick and see if there are any other questions.
There was one question about any browser compatibility issues that you should be aware of migrating over to Office 365.
So no, I think compatibility is significantly better than it was on-prem. So I tell people, well, don't use Microsoft Edge. I will say that. But IE is fine. My best experience comes from Chrome. There's no question about that, both on Mac and PC. I'm a Mac user at home, PC user at work. But Safari works as well, and Firefox, and then the Android. Well, I guess Android would use Chrome, and then Safari on iOS, and I've used Chrome on iOS, and they all seem to work pretty well. So I'm a fan of all of that. So yes, Edge is definitely the flakiest in 365. I don't understand it, but whenever I give my demos to users, especially, I try to tell them, like, I'm not trying to tell you how to do your work or how to use your computer, but definitely Chrome is my best experience so far. So. Cool. Right. So that's all I got. If there's not any other questions, I think I'll throw myself back on mute.
All right. Thanks, Matt. I want to thank you for taking the time to present to us. We had a nice little crowd that gathered at one point, but like I said, we're going to be posting this video online as well for the rest of the group and the people that couldn't join us.